Perfect. I think we're ready. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well during this difficult time. My name is Nathan Lawson, and I'm the president of the Oxford Climate Society. I'm also an undergraduate studying geography at the University of Oxford. So just to say a little bit about the society, the Oxford Climate Society is part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which since the advent of COVID is now teaching over 1,300 people globally from a range of ages and backgrounds. We also run the world's largest student-run climate journal called Anthroposphere, and we're currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculum. Today's event is entitled Climate Colonialism and discusses the historical influence of colonialism in causing climate change and its disproportionate effect on Black and brown people around the world. Colonialism is deeply related to climate from its very onset. Colonialists have used climatic variability around the world to justify their colonial practices, conceptualizing people living in warmer climates as exotic and other. In a European imperial context, climatically determined differences between human races, in inverted commas, and cultures was central to Western European self-conceptions of an inherent superiority over other peoples, offering to early expansionists apparently scientific grounds for believing in their own imperial sense of cultural supremacy. Another aspect that is seldom mentioned is how many climate solutions can be and often are neo-colonial when it comes to things like land rights and equity. Underdeveloped development and carbon offsetting, Western countries and companies can displace indigenous populations from their own land, leading to disputes that are reminiscent of historical colonial practices. Further, the top-down approaches to many climate solutions that come from universities, think tanks, and international regulators can often act to displace and undervalue local indigenous knowledge, leading not just to physical colonization, but also the colonization of the mind. So to help us explore this topic, it's our pleasure to welcome two incredibly distinguished experts. Our first speaker, Anuradha Mittal, is the founder and executive director of the Oakland Institute. Mittal is an internationally renowned expert on development, human rights, and agricultural issues. She's a recipient of several awards and was named the most valuable thinker by The Nation magazine. Mittal has authored and edited numerous books and reports. Her articles and opinion pieces have been published widely in newspapers such as the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and The Nation. Anuradha has addressed the US Congress, the United Nations, and given several hundred keynote addresses, including invitational events from governments and universities across the world. So we're very lucky to have her as a speaker tonight, so thank you and welcome, Anuradha. Our second speaker, Mr. Nimo Bassey, is an architect, environmental activist, author, and poet who chaired Friends of the Earth International from 2008 through to 2012, and was the executive director of Environmental Rights Action for 2 decades. He was one of the Times Magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2009, and Nimo Bassey was named a laureate of the Right Livelihood Award in 2010, which is also known as the Alternate Nobel Prize. In 2015, he received Nigeria's national honor as member of the Federal Republic in recognition of his environmental activism. And currently, Nimo is the director of Health of Mother Earth Foundation. So welcome to Nimo as well. So just to explain the structure of the event very quickly, there are 3 main parts. We'll start by each of our speakers giving a short speech with their thoughts on the topic before moving to questions from myself. And the last section is questions from you, the audience. So as ever, if you do have questions, please do pop them in the YouTube live stream. And also, as you always do, keep chatting because it's a great way to connect with other interested people. So without further ado, to kick us off, I'd like to pass over to Anuradha to start us off.
Thanks, Nathan. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Nimo, again, just such an honor to be sharing this platform with you. So I will head straight into, Nathan, thanks for framing the context of a conversation today. As you said, historical process of colonialism and theft of natural resources has always been done by providing a rationale ranging from bringing civilization to the savages, to protecting the environment, to conservation of the commons. So in the limited time that I have, to make sure that you don't think this is kind of an ideological premise that I'm coming from, I want to offer an example of fortress conservation in northern Tanzania, which has wreaked havoc on the lives of the Maasai, and the impact of false climate solutions on villages in Uganda. These examples are, however, a reality that is all too familiar to indigenous and poor communities around the world. In too many places, collusion between national governments, private corporations, and large conservation groups is not just forcing the indigenous and poor off the land, but forcing them out of existence, all in the name of environmental and climate protection. So let me talk about Tanzania. The Great Rift Valley in East Africa for centuries has been home to the Maasai, semi-nomadic pastoralists. In Ma, the Maasai language, Serengeti means the place where the land runs on forever, or endless plains. This is where, with the rivers, forests, marshes, savannas, arid expanses, home to nearly 70 large mammal and over 500 bird species, the Maasai herd their cattle alongside wild animals. The Serengeti has been the Maasai land for centuries. The Maasai were once as rich as the land that supported them. Maintaining its health had everything to do with their own prosperity. Such an intimate connection made them de facto stewards of the land, conservationists without title or designation. But today, Serengeti is a land that was to run forever, is a myth for the Maasai. The Maasai have weathered disease and drought, but the most serious threats of the past 75 years have come in the form of conservation laws and foreign investment. As areas have been deemed protected or transferred to new owners, the Maasai have been driven into smaller and smaller areas, creating a map of confinement that is stifling and foreign to them as a zoo to a lion. In August 2017, fire and destruction ripped through several Maasai communities in the Loliondo region. 185 bomas were demolished. Over 5,800 homes were damaged. More than 20,000 Maasai were left homeless, along with significant losses of livestock. The press release of the Tanzanian Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism said that the bomas were burned under government orders in order to preserve the ecosystems in the region and attract more tourists. With ecotourism becoming the fastest growing sector within the tourism industry, East Africa's Rift Valley has become a tourist destination. And to some, Maasai are interruptions to the pristine view and wildlife experience, which is advertised by the tourist industry. Two tourism-based companies in Loliondo have had a particularly negative impact: Boston-based Thompson Safaris and Otello Business Corporation. OBC brings members of the Dubai royal family to Loliondo on a private landing strip for the last 28 years, with complete UAE cell phone networks to hunt and trap rare animals. Tanzanian government forces, in collaboration with the OBC security guards, have violently evicted Maasai communities over the years, burning their bomas, their belongings, displacing their livestock. And one of the official reasons given for the eviction is that the Maasai's cultivation of small plots of land for subsistence agriculture was leading to environmental degradation, while completely disrespecting the impact of a private airstrip in the middle of wildlife migration routes. But it is important to understand the violence of the OBC and Thompson Safari within the context of the history of marginalization. Now, long before companies like Thompson and OBC arrived in Tanzania, land laws challenged the Maasai and their ways of life. German Empire in the late 19th century formed the basis of Tanzania's colonial land laws. It converted all territorial land into crown land, and any land without evidence of ownership and continued use was considered vacant. This resulted in the theft of over 1 million hectares of land from the local communities. After the First World War, Tanzania became a British colony. In 1923, the British colonial government passed a land ordinance, which, along with its many amendments, was a primary piece of land legislation in the country until 1999. According to the ordinance, all Tanzanian land, whether occupied or not, was considered public land, and all public land and their rights were to be controlled by the governor. In 1940, the colonial government passed Game Ordinance 159 that created national parks, including Serengeti National Park. and game reserves, and imposed the first restrictions on settlement and use of the region. By 1957, Serengeti National Park was split into two regions to preserve the region's natural beauty. One region would become Serengeti National Park, where all human habitation, including the Maasai, would be prohibited. The second region would become known as Ngorongoro Conservation Area, including the Ngorongoro Crater, which was to be a multiple land use area. In order to enforce the plan, the colonial government persuaded the Maasai to vacate. In exchange for leaving the plains, they were told that they could inhabit the newly formed Ngorongoro Conservation Area. They were promised development of better water resources, participation in governing of the area, and much more. The Maasai agreed to leave on the terms and put their declaration unconditionally in writing. The verbal commitments made by the colonial government were just that, verbal, which created an imbalance between the promises of the Maasai and those of the colonial authorities. The Maasai vacated the Serengeti and made their home in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area and the Loliondo area. With this, customary rights of the Maasai to the area were forever vanquished. The 1959 National Parks Act not only created the boundaries of the Serengeti National Park, but it also gave the authority to the governor to declare any land in Tanzania a national park. In the years leading up to 1970s, much changed on the ground. International conservation groups, such as IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, it gained influence over conservation laws across Africa. These groups lobbied for increased restrictions on cultivation, grazing, movement within the NCA. Throughout the 1960s, enforcement of these rules increased, including jail time, fines, confiscation of property, especially cows of the Maasai. So it is within this context of marginalization, we need to understand the plight of the Maasai today, or the horrors that are unleashed by companies such as Thomson Safari or OBC. For a century, the Maasai have been the ancestral occupants and guardians of the land in East Africa's Great Rift Valley. Their lifestyle, livelihoods, and culture are dependent on the thriving surrounding ecosystems. This kind of long-term care and conservation should be rewarded and lauded. Instead, the Maasai are fighting for their lives, facing violence, eviction, starvation, and disease as foreign investors and tourism enterprise seek to profit of this stewardship. I'll move to another example, a little different, which Nathan touched upon, today's climate solutions or the false climate solutions. This is based off the work that we have done as the Institute in Uganda. In Uganda, Green Resources, a Norwegian plantation forestry and carbon offset company, secured a 50-year land lease to 2 forest reserves, from which it sells carbon credits, the largest and the only purchaser being the Swedish Energy Agency. According to the company, the objective of nearly 12,000 hectare tree plantation project is to contribute to climate change mitigation, to sustainable development, socioeconomic development, and environmental conservation in Africa. Green Resources received funding from several private investors, but as well as public development institutions, including Norfund and FinFund, which today are the main shareholders of the company. The project is certified by several international bodies, including the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, Forest Stewardship Council, and the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standard. Planting trees to fight climate change sounds like a good idea, but our research has made clear that a number of questions remain around the project's credibility as a response to climate change. Whereas Green Resources claims that the project is a reforestation operation, what it's actually doing is growing non-native pine trees, which are planted to sell carbon credits, and they're later harvested and sold as timber. But the worst thing that has happened with this project is that nearly 10,000 rural Ugandans have been evicted from this land to make way for this plantation. We released this research in 2013, and despite the evidence that has been there, Norfund and FinFund continue to keep this company afloat, which went bankrupt in 2018. And it was only in 2019, after we released and exposed the eviction notices that were given to the villagers, evicting them from their own land where they depended for their livelihoods, resulting in massive starvation, that the largest purchaser of carbon credits, Swedish Energy Agency, finally terminated its contract. But the company continues to be in Uganda, continues to control the tract of land, nearly 12,000 hectares of land, while over 10,000 Ugandan villagers have been displaced from their lands. I offer these examples, and again, these are only two examples, but there's so many more that in the course of our work at the Institute that demonstrate that this rhetoric of bringing development, of fighting climate crisis, the problems created by the, the kind of, by the West, the cost of that is again being paid by the poor communities, by the Black and brown communities, as Nathan pointed out, across the world. And it can be called nothing else other than carbon violence, or we can call it colonial, greenwashing, as we continue to see. So thank you. I'll stop with that and look forward to your questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Honorable. And just to pick up on a few points, you touched on the ecotourism, and we've seen the increase in that being used as a colonial, a new method of colonialism. One thing that I've noticed that distinguishes it from, old, dare I say, traditional practices of colonialism is how much more covert they are. So it's more now, it's wrapped up with in policies, in intergovernmental agreements, and that's how it's actually manifests itself today. So you have to look a little bit deeper than usual, but we'll come on to that in our questions in a moment. Now, swiftly move on to Nimo's introductory thoughts. I'll pass over to you, Nimo.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thanks a lot, Anuradha, for your presentation. That was quite a lot of information about what's going on in Eastern Africa. So thank you so much. And also framing the issue of climate colonialism. Let me begin by saying that climate colonialism has been built on the principles of market environmentalism, which also is colonial environmentalism. By extension, climate colonialism is just like a cycle. And it's been on for a very long time, where real climate action is being outsourced, and poor, vulnerable territories and nations who never contributed to the crisis have forced to take the action. And even when we have an agreement like the Paris Agreement, which is predicated on voluntary actions by nations, when they talk about ramping up or increasing ambition, it's still those who never contributed to created the problem who are ambitious. And those who created the problem are the least ambitious, they're the least ready to carry out immediate action. They want to push the action down the road, like kicking the can down the road to next century, to future generations, as long as they can enjoy life right now. They don't care whose house gets burnt and whose rivers dry up or flood communities. And so when I look at my own backyard in the Niger Delta, I see the colonial activities of extractive industry, the oil corporations, all the oil majors, compounding the problems of adaptation to global warming, indeed forcing us to adapt. So when I hear the word adaptation, it actually makes me very angry, because I'm adapting to a problem created by somebody else, created by some corporations, some colonial forces, some politicians somewhere, and to maintain the good life and to get votes at the ballots. And then I have to adapt. All I have to do is to adapt. Keep on adapting. And some countries are unable to adapt, like Tuvalu. I mean, they're looking for a way to go. People want to relocate to New Zealand or to Australia, and they will say, no, we don't want climate refugees. They won't even agree to label you a refugee so that they don't have any kind of political responsibility over your crisis. So climate colonialism is real, it's alive, it's been on for a very long time. It creates problems. And as I was saying, talk about my backyard, I see the situation where, I mean, we all know that global warming is really created by the dependence on fossil fuels. That's a major activity in various dimensions. And the whole negotiation is about carbon molecules in the atmosphere. Nobody's talking about the carbon molecules in the ground or why we should keep it in the ground. We're looking for how to offset what is being, and offsetting is also very upsetting. It really upsets me to hear people always talk about carbon offsetting. Talk about environmental services and environmental goods, rather than looking at nature, as the services provided by nature for being nature to make us live our life as beings on this planet. And so the market controls the mindset, it controls the actions. And right now, some of the major manifestations of climate colonialism is in the manner of tackling global warming. The language of carbon neutrality and climate neutrality, net zero, which some people have really said correctly that net zero is not zero. And now the question is, what brings about all this equation? What are you going to do to be carbon neutral, to be climate neutral? That means you pollute in one hand and then you pay off or take out other activities somewhere else to offset what you've done on this hand. And now that is where the problem is really very, as Anaruda already explained about the forest conversion to plantations and then selling of the timber. It shows the illogicality of the entire, something like the reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, REDD, or plus or minus or whatever, whichever. You designate a particular forest as a forest for conserving carbon, and then nobody's allowed to go in there for farming, for hunting, for picking of herbs, for living, for celebrations, for festivals, for cultural activities, for fetching water, nothing at all. And then the other forest, you can do whatever you want with it. And so I preserve the carbon here, and I don't care what happens in the next forest. So it actually nothing. It doesn't do anything to stop deforestation. It only sometimes reflects or deflects the deforestation to somewhere else. And then this issue of placing the burden on the poor, especially under the RED project. In No RED in Africa campaign, we highlight the particular case of carbon slavery that occurred in Mozambique. And I'd just like to mention this to underscore this fact. A particular company called EnviroTrade had a community carbon project, the Nambita Community Carbon Project, where farming families, where they reached an agreement to pay them $63 per year for 7 years to plant and tend trees on certain tracts of a forest for 7 years, $63 per family, $63 per family per year to plant trees and take care of those trees. And then within the contract itself, the final letter of the contract showed that these families were not expected to do this for 7 years, but would carry on taking care of the trees for 99 years. That is several lifetimes. And so if the man who signed the contract to work for 7 years at $63 per year, the whole family dies off, the children are obligated to continue to tend those trees, and the children's children will be obligated to continue to tend those trees, intergenerational kind of servitude. So real carbon slavery of the worst kind. And this is just one example. You have carbon speculators, carbon cowboys, and all kinds of people who even sell non-existent forests, non-existent carbon. Because the whole colonial idea is to look at the forest, not as an ecosystem, but as a carbon stock. It's like a carbon stock exchange where you can do deals and well, whatever they do at the stock exchange, I don't know, but whatever is there, they ring that bell and your stocks go up or come down, and you just believe that you've got the deal or not, or whatever. But the forcing of action on poor communities, as you've heard already, has led to massive land grabs across the global south. Farmers have been forced from farming for food to farming for farming carbon, becoming carbon slaves. And the whole idea of colonial agriculture, which is cash cropping. So you either do cash cropping or you do carbon cropping. It's all the same idea. The same idea. Changes in land tenure system, people displaced, and a lot of systemic changes, having to force people to grow carbon rather than growing food, and to see trees as carbon sinks rather than living complex ecosystem that take care of communities. So these are some of the issues I would just like to bring out there in this preliminary introductory comments. And then when we have questions, we can talk a lot more about other things, especially if you want to know more about the level of pollution and complicity of Shell, Chevron, Exxon, Total, Agip, and Eni in the Niger Delta and other places across Africa and across the world.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nimo. Wow, there was a lot to touch on there. And you gave lots of examples, for example, in Nigeria with the Niger Delta, the issues that's happening now. I know Shell and BP. I read your book on To Cook a Continent, and you talked a lot about the issues more broadly in Africa. But to start off my questions, I want to just sort of take it back to more of an ideological starting point. So I want to explore what the historical relationships between colonialism and climate change are. So I mentioned climate determinism in my introduction, where colonists would conceptualize people who lived in certain climates as exotic, and people in other climates as more human, right? And perhaps starting with this concept very broadly, could you expand on what this historical conceptual relationship looks like? Perhaps Anurada, if we start with yourself.
Sure, Nathan. I mean, as somebody born in India, I can start with that. It is that racist perspective, I believe, that allowed the colonial powers to travel to places in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and to be able to view the communities and people that they met there as lesser beings, which allowed and justified theft of the resources, to destroy the industry if there was any, for instance, the textile industry in my country, to destroy it, to extract the resources, for instance, take the cotton, take everything to be manufactured and in England and then to be dumped in India. So all of that was done with the justification that it was the right thing to do. It was the moral thing to do because the communities, the people that they were encountering were savages, were lesser than them. And it was this racist perspective that allowed it to happen. And what Nimo, for instance, pointed out, or what we see in our work at the Institute around the globe, it is still that mindset which allows that this can be continued. There's not even shame and guilt about stealing resources, whether it is, you talk about climate, you show up to extract whatever you can from the earth that does not belong to you, and then try to justify it by saying you're bringing social economic development, job opportunities. They would paint the picture that Nimo just did, $63 a year. Oh my God, we're doing such good to these communities who have nothing. So I think that that's the understanding we have to understand, that they do not understand and respect the wealth that I tried to describe that the Maasai have had, the role they play, and yet to kind of come in and think that they are the saviors still as they were in the past.
Thank you. And Nimo?
Yes, well, we go back, thank you for that. It really goes back to the colonial roots, and I would say before the colonial roots hit the ground. And it's always good to remind us that colonialism became a convenient activity for transnational corporations and imperial powers, because initially the territories were discovered by transnational corporations and adventurers, and they just went, they were territories that belonged to nobody. Wherever they went to, they discovered it, they named it, and they met people living in places, and they were the ones who labeled the rivers and everything. And then they claimed monopoly of the natural resources. in a place like Congo, you had people forced to produce rubber in certain quantities, and if they didn't meet the targets, their hands were cut off, they were mutilated. And then when it got to a point where the corporations could not conveniently carry on with their brutality and banditry, they handed over the territories to colonial powers. And so the kings and the queens and the rest provided the cover, provided the military. Instead of direct mercenaries, they now had national armies, enforcing a situation of pillage, of extracting without accountability, without responsibility. And that is when they began to, everything in the territories that were colonized were done for the metropolis. They were shipped back to the imperial powers. And so agriculture was cash cropping. You had to grow cotton, you had to grow sugar, you had to grow oil palm. It was not about food, it was about commodity trading. In fact, agricultural production was not food, it was commodities. So this was all about market, about power. And if you wouldn't do that, in 1885, Akassa, a town in Niger Delta, was destroyed because the leader of that community insisted that they had to maintain their trade in palm oil. And then the imperial power said, no, we have to take over this. You cannot control, you cannot have a say. And so they burned down the whole place. And years later, it was no longer oil palm, but crude oil. So it's oil, the same oil. And we don't know which oil is coming next. Now, the whole colonial thing, climate colonialism, has gone beyond this historical part, where it's now going to the future through geoengineering, where you're going to have all kinds of other kinds of proposals for solar radiation management, about mirrors in the skies, sun shades in the skies, ocean fertilization, land whitening, and all kinds of things. And in all the models that those who study these things have seen, computer models, the negative impact are still on the vulnerable territories and nations. And so, and it makes sense really, because if I have the power if I am in control of geoengineered planetary experiments about how to control what kind of radiation comes to the planet, what comes to the earth, then of course I'll do whatever I can do to ensure that I don't have I don't suffer the negative impact, but that others who don't have a say in this experimentation will be the one to suffer the negative impact. And so the fact that somebody could want to take up the planetary thermostat is indeed a very colonial idea. So it is with the multilateral negotiations. And so people go, they say every nation has a vote, but some have votes that are heavier than others. One nation will go with 200 delegates to negotiate in different rooms, and some nation will go with just 2 delegates, and they have to negotiate in the same number of rooms over the same number of issues. So the world is a tilted system, tilted against those who've been exploited over the centuries. And I believe this kind of conversation should help us to bring up ideas to, I was going to say overturn the system, but to put the system the right way up, so that we can actually understand that colonialism is out of date and has to stop.
100%. That's given me a lot of motivation and inspiration to continue. And in fact, the next question that I've got really defines, why I do a lot of the work that we do with OCS. And it's slightly broader than colonialism. It's going to touch on race and class, but it's about the environmental movement. So many people, including myself when I first started out a few years ago, thought that environmentalism and the climate movement was predominantly a middle class or elite issue or thing to care about, and also a particularly white one. And the idea is that when you're poor, it of course makes more sense to think about the more immediate issues, such as keeping a roof over your head, or where's the next meal going to come from. But what I realized through my reading and watching the likes of both of you talk was how it's the most vulnerable communities that are also dealing with the most direct impacts of climate change on top of all these issues, and how they compound each other. So could you expand on these intersectionalities a little bit more and help to dismantle the idea that climate change or environmentalism in general is an elite issue to care about, or something that only wealthy people can care about? Nima, how about we start with yourself?
Now, why don't you let I'd rather handle this question now?
Okay, Anuradha.
I believe that when people make such propositions, it's just another way of avoiding addressing the issue and continue to place the blame on the poor, on the vulnerable, on those who never created the problem, because after all, they just care about survival. Now, in 1991, for example, let me mention this. 1991, there was a chief economist in the World Bank, wrote an email, which you can trace online, to say that most underpopulated African countries are also underpolluted, and that it made economic sense to dump loads of toxic waste in those countries. And one of the arguments was that, well, they wouldn't even live to get old enough to have certain diseases. So if they die early, they just discount them. Their life doesn't really matter. So this kind of mentality in a financial institution at that level really explains why people would say that some lives don't matter. It doesn't matter whether they live or die. Preserve resources, preserve the environment for those who have power, those who have wealth, and those who are controlling things in the world. This is extremely colonial and imperial, and is still a dominant way of thinking. That, well, what do they need? Why should they? You have the Green Climate Fund, for example, and in 2009, when that idea came up in the Copenhagen Accord, the idea was $10 billion a year till 2020, then you ramp it up to $100 billion going forward. And up till this year, they never met the $10 billion. That tickled small amount of money. And here we are in 2020. Do we have $100 billion? No. But how about the climate debt that the global north owes the global south? How about the ecological debt? Who is really the debtor and who is the creditor? And why is it so difficult to understand that lack of climate action has created a lot of life-threatening situations for vulnerable small island states, for nations in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and parts of the global north, because there's also the global north and the global south. I mean, either way. And so we look at the politics, you have to differentiate, you have to pinpoint certain places before you can draw the lines. Very difficult sometimes, but predominantly we do know that the problems have so much tilted against those who never created this issue. And now to raise the funds to help build resilience, to raise the funds to aid adaptation, to even aid the studies to understand what is going on, is so difficult. And I always like to point out that this is difficult, but when it comes to military warfare for the rich countries, there's no question about how to find the funds. $2 trillion every year spent on warfare. And you cannot raise $10 billion for green climate fund. You cannot raise $100 billion for green climate fund. And just a few climate events take more money than what the fund is supposed to be producing. So it's, I don't know, the whole connection, you cannot separate. Every single human being is exposed to the climate crisis, to the climate catastrophe. And so to say that some people don't care, they're just concerned about survival, today's survival for one day, no, they don't have tomorrow, is actually very insulting kind of suggestions.
Yeah, should I go next? Sorry.
Yep. Good.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Nimo, you said it brilliantly. The audacity of those who say that it is a concern of the white, it's a white privilege that cares more for the environment, is once again the racism that communities of colors face. Whether it is in the United States of America, where are the incinerators located? They're located in communities of color, where immigrant populations, Black, Indigenous communities live. They are not located in the hills. I live in Oakland. The flats look very different from the hills. And why? Because the white, well-to-do families live in the hills, and people of color do not live there. not because we don't care or don't want to be in the beautiful hills, because we can't live there. Our schools look different. And it is the same reality around the world. If you talk about environmentalism, when you talk about communities, I'm going to say, Nimo, in your country, when you think about the Nigerians who have fought against Shell and Chevron and others, who have fought against the dictatorship of Abacha, they are environmentalists, they are freedom fighters, they are the ones who care about development. We see the same story everywhere, that it is the reason that these defenders are being killed. They're putting their lives on the line and not to be even considered an environmentalist. So I think it is again the hijacking of the rhetoric. It is a hijacking of, the who is the good doer. You talk about hunger. Hunger has been caused by unfair trade rules that favor markets for Western corporations, just like as Nimo described. Colonialism continues. It used to happen through East India Company coming into India and then setting the viceroy and everything else. But today's colonial are these Monsantos and the Diff Cargills and ADM who are destroying markets. And then you have Bill Gates being celebrated around the world that he is going to help feed the world. He's going to give a new green revolution for Africa, completely ignoring that 80% of the food that is consumed in my part of the world, in Nimo's part of the world, is not grown by Cargill, ADM, or Bill Gates, but it is grown by family farmers who practice agroecology. They're the protectors of biodiversity and stewards of the land. But what's happening? Our farmers are starving. Our farmers are committing suicide because a new green revolution for Africa and other policies that continue to come from the West are looking at Africa, are looking at Asia as markets to be captured, where you dump your fossil fuel-based chemicals and agriculture, which is going to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. This is a solution that is offered. And then we are told that we don't care about the environment.
Incredibly powerful. Okay, so now the other main sort of aspect of how climate change is colonial is the solutions, which both of you touched on in your starting speeches. So to start with the more immediate climate solutions and how they can actually perpetuate the very colonialism that helped to cause the climate crisis, we're seeing a massive increase in the desire for carbon capture, be it natural or geoengineering. And this, of course, requires large plots of land. And so many indigenous communities are displaced in this process, which too closely reflects the past colonial practices of displacement. I know, Nimo, you've done a lot of work with on UN RED with the No RED in Africa network, and Anuradha, I know that the Oakland Institute has published many reports on these. Could you talk about the broader aspects of climate solutions that people may not think about? A lot of people think that they're doing good work, and how they're related to colonialism in this way. Who wants to go first? Nimo, would you like to?
You go first. I would love to.
Thank you for donating the time. Really, I think that in terms of climate action and solutions, the world lost it right from Kyoto when market environmentalism or market forces, which created the problem, was now hoisted as what could be the solution. This was, again, another twist was in Copenhagen in 2009, when the voluntary mechanisms came in and binding agreements and binding emissions reductions were thrown out. And then the Paris Agreement cemented this. Everything is voluntary. Do what you can do. They even called it, eventually they said, intended nationally determined contribution. That's the way it was called initially. Now they removed the intended so that you don't know that this is just suggestion by different nations, instead of looking at what is needed to be done collectively. I remember also in Copenhagen when Ambassador Lumumba, who was the spokesperson for Africa, the lead negotiator for Africa, wept at a press conference that the negotiation was leaning towards setting a target of 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, temperature increase. And he wept that meant setting Africa on fire. Today, the world is already more than one, it's about 1.2 above pre-industrial levels. 1.5 is seen as extremely ambitious. And so the other target is well below 2. And I don't know what is the difference between well below 2 and 1.5. I don't personally see what the difference is. If it's well below 2, it should be less than 1.5. That's what I thought. But anyway, so market environmentalism in terms of using market forces, artificial things, using arithmetic to solve climate problems doesn't really lay a finger on the things that needs to be done. And as you mentioned, carbon capture and storage, because the new direction of the negotiation is, well, you have to take the carbon out of the atmosphere, and engineering or technology will be a major driver of how to solve that. They don't call it geoengineering, but they say they just drive technology will solve the problem. They make technology like a fetish that can solve any kind of problem. It's like a magic wand. And so carbon capture and storage is actually something that's been on for quite a while. Oil companies use it, use the kind of variant of that to scrape the bottom of oil wells to get oil that they couldn't easily extract. So you pump in something and you get it out. So that is same as carbon capture and storage. Then they could get more fuel, more carbon from it, and then they tell you they're storing more carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's just fiction. It's to a large extent fiction. Then if you store the carbon for 1 million years and the storage fails, what happened? What did you achieve? Nothing. So the real solution, which is proposed by communities who are impacted by fossil fuel use, is keep it in the ground. We've been campaigning on this for decades now. And in Nigeria, the Ogoni people have forced fossil fuels to be kept in the ground since 1993. And not a drop is being taken. That is climate action. Rather than being recognized and paid carbon credits. If you really want to pay anybody carbon credits, the Ogoni people should be paid carbon credits for keeping the carbon out of circulation. This is number one climate action. We had the same issue in Ecuador when in the Yasuni ITT, although they were asking for exchange for cash and that collapsed. But at least the idea of leaving carbon in the ground as climate action was also prominent there. And then we have also fisher folks and other campaigners in Norway who have succeeded in keeping the claws of the oil companies away from drilling offshore Lofoten. That is real climate action. Keeping the carbon in the ground is the climate action that can be taken. Then allowing forests to serve as forests, as living ecosystem, thriving, alive, complex ecosystem with all kinds of trees, all kinds of, allowing the mangrove forests absorb much more carbon than other forests. But this is where the oil companies are destroying along the coast of Africa, digging canals through forests to take the equipment inland. And so some of them will say they are climate champions, but by destroying the mangrove forest, destroying coastal lines, destroying fresh water systems, by bringing salt water from the ocean, by pumping out more carbon to be burnt so as to make money through the refineries and so on, you find there are a lot of forces fighting against people at the grassroots who are carrying out the real climate action. The real climate action is taken by the victims of global warming. That the people in the communities who are fighting against expansion of fossil fuel extraction, of fighting for coal to be left in the hole, fighting for oil to be left in the soil, and gas to be left where it is. These are the real climate warriors. And these are the people that should be recognized for taking climate action and not criminalized, not killed, not hung, like Kensarawewa was, and Ogoni leaders were hung in 1995. These are the heroes that should be held up as symbols of the fight to preserve the planet.
Absolutely. Anurada?
Thank you, Nimo. I think Nimo has just nailed it. It is quite stunning that we still don't realize what the inconvenient truth is. The inconvenient truth is there's this desire of the Western multinational corporations to continue to get richer and richer the desire to continue to colonize the lands, and to come up with these, silver bullet solutions based in technology where the lifestyle does not have to change. It's just absolutely stunning. The push for the latest phones, which never come from blood minerals or whatever, the extraction. Here we are dealing with, we don't know what to do with the plastics, how we throw it all in the ocean if countries like China do not take the waste, the plastic waste from countries like the United States. So there's no desire to change lifestyle. And what's stunning is the level of and the lack of consciousness of the impact. It's being felt by the poor, the brown, black communities more. But climate change is one thing which does not have borders. It's impacting each one of us. And yes, the impact is first felt by communities of color, definitely, before it will be felt, but it will not leave any one of us alone. And yet the way the negotiations happen, where you continue to push for, tinkering at the edges, which does not harm the multinational corporations, it's very simple. We know what to do. As Nimo said, we know what to do. Keep the coal in the ground. When we talk about fossil fuels, leave them in the ground. There is no brain surgery or rocket science involved here. We know that. What we have to figure out how we remove those from power who are preventing that from happening. How do we ensure the warriors, the true environmental warriors that Nimo talked about, are protected? Because today, as we speak, from Brazil to India to the Philippines to the United States, around the world to Nigeria, they are being criminalized. They are the ones who are being assassinated. The world hasn't changed despite. So, the clock is ticking. We all know that. And part of me also feels perhaps humanity is overrated. We are all set on a train and we know where it's headed. And yet we continue with these pathetic, summits where these, instead of setting ambitious true goals to protect humanity, we are so focused on short-term profits and increase in our stock shares instead of finding true solutions, not for future generations, for this generation today itself.
Brilliant. And that brings me on to my next question, really, which is like almost central to this, which is the issue of development. Clearly, the Western model of development isn't working. Whilst we may have a lot of material wealth, as you mentioned, we don't know what to do with the waste of it. And there's also a massive endemic of mental health, and inequality is still strife within these so-called developed countries. So if we are to reach our climate goals of 1.5 and 2 degrees, it's pretty clear that this cannot be a mode that the rest of the world follows. With this in mind, it's very easy for the West, again in a colonial way, to lecture the global South on how to do development. So I'm interested in understanding what both of your views are on the issue of development, and perhaps whether you can propose alternate and innovative methods of development that ensures that we can meet the needs of the people within less than 1.5 degrees. And just because I'm conscious of the time, if you could keep your answers relatively brief before we move on to audience questions in a moment.
Over to you.
Anuradha.
Just say it quickly, I find it again stunning that ancient living civilizations in Africa, Asia are called developing countries. And we look at the West, which are developed countries, United States, well, I don't have to say what's wrong with or how developing it really is when you look at the attacks on democracy, when you look at racism, when you look at the amount of hunger in the so-called richest nation on earth, and its contribution to climate disaster that we have. So after all these decades and centuries, the fact that we're still debating what the right development paradigm looks like, it's not that we don't know. It's because the current paradigm that we have, somebody benefits, somebody gets rich. And when somebody gets rich, somebody gets poor. And it is maintenance of the status quo. That's why we refuse to let farmers be in the seat of developing agricultural policies. This is why we ensure the indigenous are not allowed to be able to be the stewards of the Amazon or the Bosavas around the world. It is for this reason that it has taken so long in the United States to finally have an indigenous woman be leading the Department of the Interior. This is the problem with development that we have seen from colonial times till even today, because it is continued colonization and nothing else. It is continued theft of lives and livelihoods and natural resources. So if we are going to actually ensure development, we have to ensure freedom and self-determination of all peoples. These top-down policies, they don't work. Policies designed in Brussels and Rome and Washington, D.C., it cannot happen any longer. So I'm sure Nimo would be far more eloquent than me. So Nimo, to you.
Well, you know I'm happy that Nathan, you brought up that question about so-called development. The issue should be when we look at the trajectory of where humans are coming from and where we're going. What really is development? What is development? What does it mean? And the short and long answers for me is to look at philosophies around the world. Look at Ubuntu. Look at Harambe. Harambe is Swahili for cooperation. Of course, Ubuntu, everybody knows what Ubuntu means, the African concept of my humanity being connected with your humanity. I am who I am because of you, because you are you. And then in my language, which is Ibibio, we have what we call Etuwem. Etuwem means good life. And this is totally against green capitalism, about climate capitalism. It's about living in harmony with your neighbor and with the environment. It's about living in solidarity with others, with other beings. Understand that we're just one of the beings on this planet. You are not alone. It's about adding value to somebody else's life. And with development, if I look at the level of investment in militarism in the world today and the level of destruction of countries, destruction of Libya, of destruction of Iraq, of so many places that are being bombed and torn to bits, I think this is most barbaric system warfare. The kind of warfare we're having is nothing. There's no development in a specific laser guided missile when you're making bombs that you can't even detonate because they're too expensive to be blown up. They have to be guided somewhere. You have to have nuclear buttons and you don't want your president to mistakenly lay his hands on that. This is not development, it's madness. It's madness. This is not civilization. I think the world has gone in the wrong direction and we still have a chance to learn from communities who are living close to one another, where there is solidarity, where people are living with community. All this was defined in terms of climate action in Cochabamba in 2010 at the People's Summit on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth. It was all lined up, or everything. We have to go back into the future. We have to go back, return to the future to see where we were in the past because the world has gone crazy. The development must be that we live in harmony with nature. Anything outside of that is not development.
That's a perfect articulation of it, and it really frustrates me because in my university, or just generally in the tertiary education, they just drill into you this idea that of what development is, and all you have to do, as Anurada pointed out, is just look around and look at the inequality. You know, how many people in the UK still were going hungry, and we're a developed nation, right? There was this massive issue of school kids, right, not getting enough food from the government during the pandemic, and it wasn't until a famous footballer, Marcus Rashford, held the government to account and said, "What are you doing? There's all these kids that still don't have enough food. You know, why are you not giving them enough aid?" So, yeah, I'm sorry that you aren't able to respond because you need to move to audience questions now. So,
before the next question, let me just say that what trend is. I mean, I read recently that Bill Gates owns the biggest tract of farmland in the United States.
Yeah.
That's progress. That's development. One man.
It really, frustrates me. Anyway, take a deep breath. So the first question from the audience is about oil, and it's actually directed at Nimo. Could Nimo please give more details about the exploitation slash pollution from global oil majors taking place in Africa?
I'm not sure if I heard that question.
Did you catch that? specifically for you, could Nimo please give more details about the exploitation and pollution from global oil majors taking place in Africa?
Oh, wow. Yeah. That would
Maybe,
take a whole, but I'll try
yeah.
to be brief. Now, the short part of it is that right now, when the world has for some years known that we cannot extract all the fossil fuels that we know exist, the known reserve, cannot extract and burn them without burning the planet. That has been known. And yet the corporations are searching for new oil. So right now, oil and gas has been discovered virtually everywhere on the continent, virtually everywhere. And there's a big pipeline going to be built from Uganda. And that's why in terms of election, the president will stay in power for 40 years. Has been able to relate with about 7 American presidents and is still a president. That's very interesting. Now, so there's an oil pipeline that's going to go from Uganda to Tanzania, and it's going to pass by the just near the edges of Lake Victoria. So and it's heavy crude, and you have this kind of pipeline that could disrupt and contaminate pristine ecosystems and communities in more than one country. So you have a kind of integration of the continent by pollution. Pipelines integrate Africa through pollution, and this is unacceptable. In the Niger Delta, we have the history of oil spill has been up 60 years old, the history of oil spills and gas flaring. You have millions of tons of greenhouse gases being released to the atmosphere every day by oil companies who are burning natural gas associated with crude oil extraction. And they started doing this on the argument that there was no market for natural gas. So they just set the gas on fire. And then in terms of pollution, everywhere you look, the extractive business has never, hardly benefited local communities where the resources are being extracted, whether it's diamond or gold or coal or other fossil fuels. No, everything is negative. Because all the cost is externalized. Nothing is taken care of by the environment and the people, nothing. And this is, again, because of the colonial roots of extractivism. The resources are all taken offshore. If you look at infrastructure map of Africa, you have roads and railway lines all starting from where resources are to the shoreline. They always go to the seaport because they're all being extracted for export. Started from colonial times, and neocolonialism is keeping this business running. And so contamination, exploitation, destruction, they're all going hand in hand, and they're supported by international financial systems and all the multilateral system. Because the politicians or the governments who are playing the role of middlemen or colonial warrant chiefs that were in the colonial period, they're playing the game. They believe the narrative that this is the only way to build your economy, by extracting raw materials and exporting them, and then waiting for the finished products to come back to import finished products, and tie up your economy completely wrapped up on a cannibal international economic system that doesn't think of your good. This is why Walter Rodney wrote the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I would recommend that to all those who really want to know where the roots of the harms and exploitation that we're seeing today. And another book written by a Nigerian thinker called The West and the Rest of Us, Chinwezu. If you can find that book, it's a wonderful book, a wonderful resource to read. And of course, The Rachel of the Earth, or The African Dream by Che Guevara, about the war in the Congo. It's all about resources, destruction. The war in Congo DRC is about who controls resources. And this has been the dilemma of our continent. And before somebody would say, why is this happening? We've got leaders on the continent who stood up for the people, and they were all assassinated. A man like Lumumba in Congo, who was in office for less than 3 months before he was assassinated, where he was arrested and then shortly after killed. A man like Thomas Sankara. There are many examples you could mention. And so the global system ensures that those to be exploited continuously remain under under the thumb of the capital, and of the structures, the global structures that have been set up to perpetuate this system.
Brilliant, thank you. That was very holistic. Multiple examples there of how a lot of these issues all come down to resources. Okay, I've got another question, and again, if you guys could keep your answers brief, because there's quite a lot of questions pouring in. So this one is: do you think that we should reconsider our carbon accounting standards to account for imports? Would that help with the displacement of environmental harm? I'll go to Anuradha quickly first.
Sure, Nathan. I think as Nimo and I've tried to put forward the way we're trying to deal with it, when we look at our imports, when we look at our export economy, when we start looking at everything, we're not really accounting for the greenhouse gas emissions and what the real problems are. And that's what I was saying, the inconvenient truth is. So in short, I would say, yes, definitely. It's a system, I would just also say, where we look at GDP of countries, not recognize, divorces are great for GDP. 2 cars, 2 houses, 2 of everything. Oil spills are great for GDP, cleaning operations. So we really have to rethink how we are going to the problem we have staring at us and what we're going to do about it. And continuing business as usual is not the answer.
Perfect. Nimo, do you have any comments on this one, or I've got another specific question?
I copy and paste what Anuradha said.
Perfect. Okay, so this is quite an interesting one. How is the best way to start an individual-to-individual conversation between the carbon haves and the carbon slaves, as Nimo Bassey referenced earlier? So what's the best way to start a conversation?
Between who?
The carbon haves and have-nots, but you used the term carbon slaves before. So how can we start a conversation there? What's the best way to start one?
Well, if I understood the question, the conversation is about how to stop the system, how to change the system. And it's by sitting down with those who have been forced into this very exploitative relationship, sit down, have a conversation with them about how they live their life, what they knew about their forest and what the forest means to them, and then work with them to ensure that the integrity of their forests are maintained.
Nathan, if I may add to what Nimo said, and before the sit down, we have to tackle the imbalance of power. So till we, acknowledge this, unequal power, you can sit down, but they don't really listen. So I think we have to first deal with and acknowledge that imbalance of power, where the haves have the power because they've stolen it from the have-nots. And so we would have to acknowledge that before we can have conversations.
Brilliant. And yeah, a lot of the corporations that people go on to work for, although they, like I said, they may not be directly involved with the individual workers, the company still does. So there's a lot of questions coming out about how individuals can, in light of these discussions that we've just had, can sort of fight back towards these companies. And a specific one: how can individuals ensure that we avoid funding these kind of unethical carbon capture practices? For example, ecosystem holidays as well. Anuradha?
Well, the example that I gave, which is only one of the many that we have looked at, that of the Norwegian company Green Resources in Uganda, it is taxpayers' money that is being used by Norfund, which does investment for development. FinFund, same thing. The fact that they're financing this is immoral and wrong. It is not just a concern of the Ugandan villagers who have been displaced from their lands. It should be as much of a concern for the citizens of Norway as well as Finland. And that is why it was a pressure that was put that led to Swedish Energy Agency to terminate its contract. So I think we need to look at a global, we talk about a global economy. We need to look at globalization differently, where the wrong done to me is a wrong done to you. And I think we need to find these alliances, the strategic partnerships, where we can actually put more pressure on so-called development institutions, the World Bank, the USAID, the DFIDs, the Norfunds, and the others who are guilty of greenwashing efforts of corporations. Also, a word about certification agencies. I think they need to be challenged. The fact that they get revenue for certifying things to be good and environmentally clean, when we have seen, again, from Uganda to Nicaragua and elsewhere, that they're nothing else but tools of oppression. So they need to be held accountable. Our strategy at the Institute is to expose them through our rigorous research. It's like a Dracula that has been dragged into the sunlight. It has no place to hide, no place to run. So it is, and I think it's a scientific inquiry rather than just accepting what is given to us as the development mantra or whatever, because it's coming from Western white powers.
Perfect. Nimo, have you got any comments?
No, I think that's okay. That's fine. If there's another question, you can.
Yeah.
Time is running. You are muted.
Oh, perfect. Sorry. Yeah, there's lots of questions as we come to our last few minutes. I would love to know what our guest thinks of the African Continental Free Trade Area and its potential to empower the continent versus its potential to lead a second scramble for Africa.
Interesting question. I believe that Africa shouldn't have barriers because the political boundaries between nations are artificial, they're colonial. The Africa was partitioned in Berlin, 1884. During maybe they have some hunters or we're having a tea party or whatever, and then they just took rulers and divided the continent, and now we have this big division between colonial languages that we are forced to speak, and then conflicts across the borders, and causing a lot of strife on the continent. So anything that would, we really need to, Pan-Africanism is a target that has to be pursued. Our heroes in the past, people like Nkrumah, like Nyerere, Sekou Touré, they worked hard towards this. People like Gaddafi, Nasser in Egypt, they all worked towards this. And I believe it's something that we need to continue thinking about. Now, the trade agreement, if it's to, a lot of colonial trade ideas, like the export free zones, trade-free zones, and so on and so forth, that are not really free zone, but colonial enclaves within our countries. If we just need to look at the colonial roots and how this would be of service to our people. Would it allow people to move freely in the continent, or is it just goods that we're moving without people being moving, like the way we're seeing the divides across the world? Capital and goods move freely, but humans cannot move freely. These are the challenges. I believe it's an idea that could eventually be positive, depending on the politics behind it. If it's just a colonial idea, then of course it will be a disaster.
Anuradha?
I think Nimo has said it brilliantly.
Perfect. Sorry, my sister's just popped in her head in the room. Okay. I think one or two more last questions. Just one quickly about reparations. So where do you sort of stand on this? This is obviously the idea that wealthy industrialized nations who have greatly benefited from the issues should also cause to help countries in the global south adapt. I know, Nimo, the issues that you take with that, but where do you sort of stand with it, because of the fact that whoever funds, the donors of these, often come with a dynamic of power? So how can we ensure that these reparations do not simulate the same colonial dynamics of power that have been prevalent for so long? Anuradha, would you like to take that?
The best example that comes to my mind is the reaction of colleagues from Africa and Asia and Latin America when they used to hear debt forgiveness, and it should be debt cancellation. So I'm glad to hear you use the word reparations. We're talking about rich countries that have stolen resources from the third world, countries that have contributed and are the main polluters. And for them to have to put the burden or even think about assisting or helping, it is on their conscience, and they need to move forward with that. So, but it goes back to the conversation that we've had. As long as they continue to control power and determine what development looks like, without valuing way of life that Nimo beautifully described, relationship with the land that the Maasai have, ignoring the commons and the customary land rights that communities from Papua New Guinea to Zambia still have, and yet the desire to privatize, to control and colonize. As long as we have that, I'm afraid, we'll keep having these negotiations and countries not wanting to do what they owe. Colonization, slavery, theft is no longer can be denied. And I think the burden is, I would say, for instance, members of the Climate Society, what kind of solutions will come with? What we're looking for is not just dealing with the climate crisis. What we're really talking about is justice that has been kept away from impacted communities for centuries. And without having that justice, without really seeking climate justice, we will not be able to deal with the climate crisis.
Brilliant. Nimo, if you don't have this, I really want to respect both your times. One really interesting question for Nimo, and then I'm going to ask both of you to perhaps give 1 minute of your closing remarks. Nimo, do you have any thoughts on the promises and perils of present patterns of Chinese involvement in sub-Saharan Africa for developing countries in that region? And combining that, could you finalize with your finishing comments as well, please? Thanks.
Well, I wish we had more time to speak at length about this. At the end of the day, the Africans have to stand up for themselves. We have to draw up the pattern of where we want to go, where we're coming from. We've had leaders in the past who have dreamt of what it means to achieve the well-being of the African people, and by so doing relate equally with people from elsewhere in the world. And I still think that this is the best way to go. Not whether people are coming from the east or from the west to invest and to exploit, because everybody coming here is coming to Africa is coming to exploit Africa. So the question is, who is exploiting in a better way and who is exploiting in a worse way? I think it's an argument that I don't want to get into at this moment.
Brilliant. And Anuradha, have you got any final comments to leave our viewers with?
Yeah, I feel like we're just starting the conversation, Nathan. And I will say, in the course of our work at the Institute, where we look at so-called investment in agriculture around the globe, but specifically in Africa, it's not just the Chinese or the Indians or the Saudis, which is again the racist discourse that we have heard. The largest thieves that we found in the name of investment were actually from the United States and Europe. And as Nimo said, this is not about who's a little kinder, who's a little gentler, or who can use the language of political human rights while still violating. This is about continued colonization, whether it is Africa, Asia, Latin America, the people of those continents. Communities have to be self-determining their progress, their path towards development. It is time when leaders are not assassinated and their corruption allows for the corrupt people to be in power. Very often people will say, oh, leaders in Africa are corrupt, but I think they are nothing in comparison to the corruption of the World Bank and the West leaders who plant their ideologues there. So it is really time for independence and every nation being able to forge forward its own destiny in collaboration with its neighbors. And as long as it's prevented, it's not about who's better, the Chinese or the English or the Europeans.
Brilliant. That's so true. Brilliant. So it's 20 past, which brings us to the end of our discussion. And like you said, I hope this is just the beginning, because there's so much I want to continue to talk about. And also just to personally say thank you. And I know that a lot of my colleagues and students find both of you incredibly inspiring and no pun intended, but give us the fuel to continue the work that we do. If you just stay on the line, I'm just going to quickly pitch for our event next week. So our next event to all the members of OCS is on Monday, the 1st of February. And this is on Chinese environmental policy with Dr. Judith Shapiro, who's the author of China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Earth, and Ma Jun, who's a leading Chinese environmentalist and director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs in Beijing. And that's at 3 p.m. So thank you all for joining. And Anuradha and Nimo, the chat's been going amazing. We've had an incredibly international audience today. So once again, thank you. And I hope to see you all at the next event. Anuradha and Nimo.